So back to the passage that Paul read today, very famous passage. I consider this passage to be a very good converting passage, a converting verse. So it's great for producing conversions. And I say that because it kind of was for me. This is my personal experience. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my personal story. It goes back to the fall of 1974, which wasn't that long ago. I don't care what anybody says. And in the fall of 1974, I was 17 years old. Sweet young thing. And off I went to university. Whoop-de-doo. And reason being, that's what you did. So I had done the 5-year course at high school. I mean, I had grade 13. And that's what you're supposed to do, is go to university. So that's what I did. To me, I think in my mind it was, elementary school, high school, university. I had no idea of going to university to get a career. I had no idea, I had no profession in mind. I had no goal. I just was following through, right? So off I go to university, and because I'd taken maths and sciences in high school, I took maths and sciences in university. And I really, really struggled for the first time in my life. So I was, big fish in a little pond in Halliburton. It's not the same in Toronto. You're a little fish in a really big pond, and that really kind of was overwhelming. So it was quite a big deal for me. It was quite a struggle for me, and there's a whole lot of stuff in there that I'm not going to go into today. So there's a lot of factors happening in my life. I'm staying in residence, and there were some Christian guys in the residence I was staying in, and somehow or other they got me onto reading the New Testament. So this conversion was happening. So, and I started reading for the first time, I guess, on my own, because I just wanted to, the New Testament. So I'm starting to read Matthew, which is the first up when you open the New Testament. And I just remember saying, wow, this is good stuff. This is cool. I like this. I'm kind of picking up what's getting put down here. So when you get early into the Gospel of Matthew, you come to the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and Jesus is saying, blessed are those who mourn, and blessed are the meek, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And I'm thinking, wow, this is good stuff. And, he teaches, the Lord's Prayer is in there. That's where it came from. Who knew? So all this great stuff. And then as I moved along, I get to chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And I was like, just like, wow, this really struck me for some reason. So, I was 17, and bang, this verse in particular hit me. I think back, I used to underline my Bible all the time, and I'm pretty sure that's all underlined and highlighted and stuff, because that was a big one for me. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. It was just like it was like kind of an aha moment. It was yeah, that's for me. Now, I've had some time to think about that over the last few decades. And when I kind of ponder on that experience, I got to stop and think, well, how weary and burdened really was I? How weary and burdened could I have been? Like, for instance, I didn't have a marriage I was working through. I didn't have children I was trying to take care of, let alone grandchildren. I didn't have a job. I didn't have a debt. So really, I was basically a child with very little to no responsibility. I was supposed to go to class, I guess. And I hadn't done horrible things. I hadn't gone to prison. I hadn't robbed anybody. I hadn't, overly much lied. I haven't dealt drugs. I hadn't done any of those horrible things, so-called horrible things. And, I wasn't struggling. If we look around the world then and now, there's always people really struggling. I mean, just to make ends meet, to have food on a daily basis, to get fresh water, health needs and concerns. I mean, all that stuff, I had none of that. Basically, I was this, kind of middle-class, white, privileged kid who was being given the opportunity of a lifetime to go to university. I didn't realize this at the time, of course, that very few people in the world would get that opportunity. There it was. So, and yet I was dissatisfied. I didn't know why I was there. In fact, in the first few weeks I was there, this is the mid-'70s, you try to be cool and like a hippie, your hair's down here, say really cool things, and I would say things like, why are we here? Why am I here? What's it all about, guys? And not that I was particularly deep, because I really wasn't. I wasn't really thinking, as shown by the fact that I was in university with no clue as to why I was there. But, so I was asking those questions, but in some kind of subconscious level, I think I really was asking those questions. But, I was dissatisfied. I really didn't see where I was going, what the point to life was, and there was something going on inside. There was something that I wasn't even particularly conscious of. And that's kind of the point. Come to me, Jesus says, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That covers so much of the human experience. It can cover, it can cover yours. People who have a real strong sense of their brokenness and their sinfulness, like Paul did. The good that I would, I don't do, and the evil that I would not, that I do. Now, Paul was a good living guy. But as life unfolded and as God's Spirit worked in his heart, he got to that point. I'm at that point now. I get that. I didn't get that point when I was 17. And so that wasn't my burden. I wasn't struggling with debt and, family life and all that. I had none of those worries, but something was bugging me. So the point is, it doesn't have to be some dramatic thing that causes us to come to the point where we understand our need and that we come to Jesus. Barb Peel's not here today, so I'm going to tell one of her stories. So don't tell her, John. So Barb, actually, I've heard this from her a couple times recently. She will tell us, reminds me of a time, so we Peggy and I and others back in the 70s would go to these things called the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International breakfasts. You want me to say it again? No. and they used to have them in Peterborough, big ones in Peterborough, but they also had little ones at the Cozy Corner here in Halliburton. And so Christians of all stripes would kind of get together there, and they would bring in a guest speaker with an amazing testimony, right? You get the testimony. And the testimony would always be something like, well, I was a sailor and I used to cuss and do crazy bad stuff, and then I ended up in prison for 5 years, and I dealt drugs in the street. And then I met Jesus and my life has been turned around, which is wonderful and really kind of startling and kind of impressive. And so Barb said, I'd go home from one of those and I'd say, man, I wish I had a testimony like that. And then she'd say, well, hold it. No, I don't. So yeah, you don't need to have gone through all that. It isn't required. It isn't necessary. All God's looking for is what's genuine. What's real in the human heart. What's really you and where you're really coming from. Just honesty. And I think that's starting to go. Honesty just compels us to understand that we are burdened and heavy laden and weary without Christ. So how does this work? So to me, I put these two things together. Jesus says, come to me. So the coming to Jesus and the laying down of the burden, to me, they're one and the same thing. They're synonymous practically. When you come to Jesus, there's a kind of that really means you're taking your burden, your weight, the thing that's on your shoulders, the thing that's weighing you down somewhere inside or outside, or in your issues in your life, whatever it might be, your concerns. And he relieves you of those, and you experience it. And for some of us, the thing that happens is kind of automatic somehow. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like magical. That's what happened to me back in 74. Like I kind of read the passage and was like, boom. And the burden was gone and I felt great joy, that kind of thing. But for others, it's not so simple. And I suspect that maybe even as we get older, there's more of a process involved. And I've called that process, for some it's determination plus conversation. Determination plus conversation. So it's kind of more like the song we sang with the kids, I have decided to follow Jesus. For some people, I think it's really, they have to come to a point where they actually decide. I don't remember actually deciding. It was like a no-brainer. Like it was, of course. So deciding, for us as we're older, we have more options, don't we? And we can follow this track, let's get rich and get happy that way. That's the whole track that the world presents to us. There's other kinds of religions. There's Hinduism and there's Islam, and there's all kinds of stuff out there now. Ways to find yourself and find, whatever the meaning of life is about. But Jesus is calling us to himself. And he's saying, I'm the way. And he's saying, come to me. So at some point, it's an act of will to say, yes, I'm going to do that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I'm going for it. So it's probably that's a determination plus conversation. And how would you lay your burdens down? You might have to have a talk with him. That's called prayer, but people don't need to know it's called prayer till later. Okay, so let's think for a second. Most of you are Christians and you're used to praying, maybe all, I don't know. But if you weren't, where would you start? You probably get away by yourself somewhere because you don't want anybody to hear you in case they think you're crazy. And you start talking to God who might be there, right? God, if you're there, Jesus, if you're there, I read this thing about, come to me and you'll take my burdens. And I got some. And you kind of lay out some of the issues and the heartaches and the pain and the difficulty and just kind of lay it all out there. So if you can handle that, if you can take that, that would be awesome. And bam, something happens. The magic happens. The miracle happens. And he does take it. He says it here. I will give you rest. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's a promise from the lips of Jesus Christ. And that's something you can absolutely bank on. When people do that, they experience that. So that's kind of conversion, sort of. Conversion is a Latin word. It means verso, to kind of turn or twist, con together. So it means to turn all together, to turn yourself all at the same time. So instead of just kind of leaning over and looking at the choir, you actually turn all the way around and look at the wall. And you head in a different direction. You're going this way and you're heading that way. But conversion is not a one-time deal. Contrary to, I think, a lot of what people think, a lot of Christians think, that they had a conversion and that's it. But it's not. So conversion is an ongoing process. It's something that is lifelong. If you had a conversion experience, that was the beginning of your conversion. And hopefully, if you've walked with Christ or you've been a Christian for a while, you know what I'm telling you is true. I hope. But there's constantly opportunities for you to have your mind changed and your heart changed and to re-grasp the things we're talking about here today. So, for instance, it's a conversion from independence to dependence on God. Our natural state of affairs is we take care of ourselves, thank you. That's independence. Conversion moves us to dependence on God. Now, we don't entirely go from one to the other in one fell swoop. That's an over and over again reminding, hey, you're independent about this. You need to take that to God. It's a movement from worrying about, fill in the blank, worrying about your health, worrying about your future, worrying about your finances, worrying about your kids, worrying about your world, worrying about the American politics, worrying about the environment. Lots of stuff to worry about. It's a movement from just worrying about that to trusting God with that. Now, it's not that we shouldn't be concerned with all of those things. We should. But the Christian life is one where God allows us to have burdens, and then he expects us to hand them over and to trust him with it. And do our part, but trust him. It's a movement from figuring it out for yourself, thinking through all the strategies of life, to prayer. To prayer, to seeking God's help and his counsel in the midst of everything that we're going through. And none of these things happen overnight. They're lifetime, lifelong movements, the movement of conversion. So whenever, on a day-to-day basis, you and I turn to Jesus, Jesus says, come. He's not just saying that the first time. He's saying that to you today. Come to me. Now, all you who labor and are heavy laden. And this is his promise. I will give you rest. And it's absolutely true. It's my experience and many of our experiences. But there's a second part in this passage. Okay? That's the come to me part. The second verse, which I don't know that I was into so much or understood or was grabbed by as much in 1974 as I am perhaps now. The second part is, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Take my yoke upon you. What did he mean by that? I mean, we don't talk about yokes very much nowadays. In Jesus' days, it was used a lot. It had a bunch of different uses, yoke. One of the uses pertained to rabbis. So Jesus was a rabbi among many rabbis. There's all kinds of teachers. If you were invited to be the disciple of some rabbi, you would take on the yoke of that rabbi. So you may have read that in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, Paul, it says he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. That's one way of saying he was a pupil of the rabbi Gamaliel, and also he took on upon himself the yoke of Gamaliel, which meant primarily, I mean, these guys were teachers of the law and interpreters of the law, the Torah, the law of Moses. It meant that you bought into their interpretation of the law, so which I think is pretty interesting. So I thought, well, what kind of stuff were they teaching? And I found this little book in my library. It's called The New Testament Background Selected Documents. Exciting title. And it was required reading. It required reading in Bible college. It was in Bible college for a year. And I don't think I really appreciated it that much back then, as much as I do now. It's funny how things are like that, right? You don't appreciate it. So this is a rabbi, in his perspective. I think his name is Rabbi Aboth. He writes this. So this is from about the first century, about Jesus time. Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to the men of the great synagogue. They said three things. They love to enumerate things. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the law. Simeon the just was of the remnants of the great synagogue. He used to say, by three things is the world sustained: by the law, by the temple service, and by deeds of loving kindness. Antigonus of Soko received the law from Simeon the just. He used to say, be not like slaves that minister to the master for the sake of receiving a bounty, but be like slaves that minister to the master not for the sake of receiving a bounty. And let the fear of heaven be upon you. It's a little rabbinic teaching, guys, from the first century. I hope you followed all that. It may seem a little bit foreign or unfamiliar to you. But do you notice how it rings a bit of the way Jesus spoke? Somewhat. One of the main differences you notice here is a lot of these rabbis would quote somebody else. And in their teaching, they would say, Simeon the Just used to say, and Antigonus of Soko would say this. And if you watch Jesus, he doesn't do that. He will say, the scriptures say this, but I say unto you. And his interpretation is his interpretation. So, if we take on the yoke of Jesus, we're coming up against, in this sense, where we accept his interpretation of Scripture, we're hearing things like Jesus. So the Sermon on the Mount was basically Jesus unfolding the Torah, the law of Moses, to us. And in verse 21 of chapter 5 of Matthew, he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. So he basically quotes the Bible. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. So Jesus interprets that scripture, actually one of the commandments, thou shalt not kill, and gives us a whole different depth to it. It's not just about killing, it's about the attitude of your heart and about being angry with somebody. One of the passages I often read at weddings is the only passage that in Matthew, I think it's 19, where Jesus talks about marriage. And I'm not saying this to put any guilt trip on anybody here who's married, just whatever, just to tell you what Jesus did. So Jesus, what he does is he quotes from Genesis. And he says, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So that's just all a quote from Genesis chapter 2, the Torah. And then he says, and the two shall become one. So then Jesus says, what therefore God has joined together, so the two they are no longer two but one. What therefore God has joined together, let nobody pull apart. A little commentary there on the scriptures. So the whole thing is, if this is what taking on his yoke is, he is calling us to buy into his interpretation of Scripture. And, as you go through the Gospels, you find all kinds of stuff about love, the love commandments, forgiveness, servanthood, the use of gifts, the use of our talents, on and on and on. So that's one way of looking at this, take my yoke upon you. Now, it could also carry, for the peasants that were listening to Jesus that day, I'm guessing a lot of it may have carried the idea of the oxen they could see on the hills around them, because it's a very agricultural society, pulling the plows. Wasn't that long ago they used to be doing that around here. You can go to the museum, you can find the plows, the hand plows, and they were actually pulled by oxen. Everybody knows that oxen are cows, right? So, yeah, you did know that? Okay, so an ox is one cow, oxen, that's probably two cows, or a team of, it's multiple cows, a team of oxen is two cows, trained to pull a plow. Can you imagine doing that in these parts back in the day? If you notice, if you walk any of the old fields around here, you'll notice everywhere you look, there's piles of rock. Because what our fields grew was rock. and every year, a new crop came up. And they had to go out with their stone boat and pick up the rocks, and then so those piles just got higher and higher and higher. I'm going to give you a side story that has nothing to do with the sermon, but I just can't resist. They're putting fiber optic up our hill, up our road, Riverside Drive. And so that requires digging a trench to lay the pipe down. And so that's going along swimmingly. They do it really fast, but except they got a problem where they cross under people's driveways or side streets. So they had, last week, they had this piece of equipment there. And we looked at it, and there was about 10 guys looking at it. And they looked at it for about 2 or 3 days. And I got talking to one guy after, and he says, we call it the ditch witch. And the whole idea is it's a horizontal drill to drill underneath driveways and underneath, underneath side streets to get the thing under there without breaking up the pavement and all this kind of thing. So it obviously wasn't working very well. It took a lot of people several days to get under like one driveway. So I asked the guy, I said, how is it at drilling through granite? He says, oh, it's terrible at drilling through granite. Hello? You know where we are? Anyway. So they were running into a few difficulties. And that's the difficulty with growing things and plowing fields around here. But I digressed quite a bit there. So if you have a team of oxen, the way it works is you have a senior ox and a junior ox. The one knows the business and the other one is the learner. It's, what's that word? When you have an apprentice, if you will. There's an apprentice ox pulling beside the experienced ox. And that's how the younger ox learns. So the senior ox is taking the weight, doing most of the work, but the other one is learning how to do it, how to walk, how to take commands, what you're supposed to do. And I think that's part of the idea that Jesus is seeking to convey here. What he's telling us is, come alongside me, yoke up with me, and pull along with me. See things from my perspective. Be part of my mission. Look at the world the way I look at the world. We tend to look at the world very introvertedly, very self-centeredly. And Jesus never, ever did. He came here to love people around him. And he saw their beauty, and he saw their potential, and he sought to love them and to serve them and to make their lives better and to set them free. And he wants us to be in on that. Say, do you see them the way I see them? And then come on in. Let's come pull with me as I do my mission. I came to love the people of the world. You love them too. I came to heal the people of the world. You heal them too. I came to set at liberty the captives of the world. You set them at liberty too. I came to feed them. You feed them too. I came to bless them. You bless them too. That's what it means to be in the yoke with Jesus and pulling. And then he says, when you do that, you will find rest to your souls. It's almost like a deeper level of rest. Rest deep within. You're doing something. You're not just lying there. So you're actually working in a sense. But he says you'll have this deep rest in your soul because you'll be involved with what it's all about. God's mission of reconciliation to the world around us. And he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So it's not zero. It's just the right weight. Just the right weight. But what he's saying here is the whole thing today is telling us he's going to take your heavy burden and then he's going to invite you to share a little bit of his light burden. Right? Quite a switch, quite a swap. So 2 questions. Will you come and keep coming to our rescuer, to Jesus, on a daily basis? 2, will you share his yoke? Shall we pray?